Welcome to part 1 of Therian. I'm Colleen McKnight, and I hope you enjoy the story. Friday, 3:12 a.m. In the firelight, filthy hands carefully fitted the skull of the deer upon the top of a carved wooden pole. Strips of hide that had been soaked in blood and pitch were pushed through and wrapped around the base of the skull over and over, rooting it solidly into place so that even when the thing stood taller than a man, it would never topple off. Another length of wood was fitted over a notch in the pole to form a cross, wet leather straps tied and knotted around the junction, each end of the new wood becoming an outstretched arm when draped with a tattered canvas. In the dancing light of the flames, the man could imagine that stick figure was real, some dark and murderous forest god come to deliver its judgment under a towering crown of antlers. He admired it for a time, but not for too long, as he knew that he must bring it to meet the others. They waited in a secret place, a cavern left under a massive stone outcropping, tall enough for the man to walk through and wide enough for many to gather. There were bones here when he first discovered the place, and he understood what it wanted him to do. He brought more bones and arranged them in patterns, placing the skulls of the fallen animals into crevices and hanging feathers on sticks as adornments. But this hallowed ground was more than just a catacomb. Antlered skulls of deer had been given a special honor, placed upon poles and positioned into lines so that they would all stare toward the back of the chamber, dozens of them, waiting for the one that would stare back. When the man found this latest skull, this giant among them, there was no doubt that it was the one. Now he slowly, ceremoniously, arranged his grand creation so that it could look down upon the others through its hollow, empty eyes. The gathering was complete. The Deer King had come. To anyone that stumbled upon it, the scene would appear as if a skeletal chaplain was leading some forbidden service, a devil's court, all gathered in this dark church of the wilderness. To the man, it was a sanctuary, and as he knelt before the king at this late hour, when the world was sleeping, that's when he could feel the will of it. And tonight, that will was more powerful than ever. Saturday, 4:49 p.m. Red emergency lights strobed through the fog and drizzle as the EMTs hurriedly wheeled a stretcher bearing Leonard Gandering out of his home. The old man clutched at his chest as his wife screamed at the paramedics, his face a grimace of pain and terror. Across the street, young Mark Callum watched from behind the curtains of his living room window. As the ambulance pulled away, Gandering's wife turned her fury to the remaining police officer and motioned wildly with her hands, pointing at the Callum's house across the street. Mark's parents weren't home from work yet. All the lights in the house were off. The skull with antlers and cloak still lay on the ground where Mark had dropped the thing, and there was no retrieving it now. The policeman who spoke with Mrs. Gandering spent a few minutes more with her before turning and walking toward Mark's house. A harsh knocking on the door left the boy frozen in place, and he squeezed his eyes shut as he hid behind the couch. A few moments passed before a second round of knocking thundered through the home, but then there was silence, and after a few more minutes, Mark heard Mrs. Gandering. He dared another peek, and the policeman went back across the street, speaking with the old lady. It would be an hour before his mother got home. Mark didn't know if Mr. Gandering was going to die. He felt like his chest, arms, and legs were filled with ice, and he could barely breathe or swallow. At 11 years old, his mind drowned in a combination of boy logic, wild confusion, and dread. He had no idea what to do. Sunday, 11:41 a.m. The station bustled as Detective Mallory tried to ease the tension gripping Mark's parents. "We're trying to fully understand what happened right now. It's important for us to determine if your son has befriended somebody new, possibly an adult." The detective was patient and calm. Mark's mother was not. "We've already told you that he doesn't know anyone." Jen Callum was frazzled after having spent the morning at the police station. The boy's father reached over to squeeze his wife's hand as he tried to match the detective's cool demeanor as he spoke. "We're as confused as anybody right now, believe me, but my wife is correct. He's just an 11-year-old boy and doesn't have any friends that we don't know about. The Ganderings are the only other people that live in the neighborhood. It's a brand new subdivision, and all of the other houses are still under construction. There's nobody around." Detective Mallory nodded slowly as he held his hands up in a placating gesture. "I understand, but I need both of you to accept the possibility that there are things about your son that you don't know. So far, you didn't know that he's had trouble adjusting to his new school and that he's not sleeping well because of nightmares. I can tell you that he's been sneaking into the woods in the afternoons and that he's formed some sort of attachment to the deer. So please consider that there might be other things you don't know so that we can help Mark." "My son doesn't need help." Jen Callum shot up from her chair. "Jen," Mr. Callum reached for her, but this time she shrugged him off and pointed at Detective Mallory. "You listen to me. Leonard Gandering is at home right now, resting comfortably. No harm, no foul. He had a panic attack over a prank. The old man is an obstinate ass just trying to get attention. Believe me, I sold him his goddamn house. Now my son has been trapped in a police station all morning over nothing. This is bullshit, and you know it." Detective Mallory nodded, pressed a button on the phone intercom, and spoke in a tired voice. "Please bring me the Callum evidence to my desk." A moment later, an officer appeared with a long, sizable object wrapped in blue, opaque plastic. Mallory gently took the object from the officer and laid it upon an empty desk to carefully unwrap. The smell of it wafted out before it was visible, and Jen Callum's face wrinkled. But when Mallory pulled the plastic back, the Callums stared in dumbfounded silence. The detective gave them a moment to take it in, and then carefully lifted the pole so that the dirty tarp could fall out like a robe. The effigy loomed tall, and Mallory took advantage of their shock. "Imagine you are Leonard Gandering sitting at home yesterday afternoon. It's getting dark, it's foggy, and this thing walks out of the woods." Jen Callum turned pale and covered her mouth with her hands. "Oh my God." Mallory carefully placed the effigy back on top of the desk. "When I look at the details of this thing, I see craftsmanship. I see hours of work put into it." He looked at both Callums. "What I don't see is a sheet with holes in it, which is what I would expect of a boy pulling a prank." He let his words hang there for a moment before asking, "Do you think that Mark is capable of making a thing like this?" Mr. Callum never took his gaze from the thing. "No." Jen Callum went silent. Mallory continued, "In cases where adult involvement is suspected, we need to move quickly." Jen found her voice. "Is he in danger?" Mallory stayed calm. "I don't know. That's why it's important to find out exactly what's happening so that I can help you." He watched as she had to search for her next words. "We never meant to leave him alone. He was home alone, and we never meant to leave him there, but the market has been tough. I have to work late sometimes, and my husband travels." Mallory nodded. "I get it. We all make sacrifices, and I'm not here to judge your parenting. I just want to make sure that Mark is safe, and when I see something like this, it concerns me." The intercom buzzed, startling the Callums. A woman's voice spoke. "Mark and I are finished. Are you ready for us?" Mallory sighed and pressed the intercom and lightened his voice. "Of course. Please join us." He looked back at the Callums. "We'll need to pick this up as soon as possible." At that moment, the therapist walked out with Mark. The boy's face was pale, although somewhat better than this morning. He was obviously shaken and went straight for his mother. She rose to meet him halfway and hugged him deeply. Mark's eyes fell upon the effigy, and then he looked down to the floor. The therapist smiled. "Your son is very smart and a brave young man." She then looked at Mallory and gave him a slight nod. "Mark needs to get home and rest." Mallory understood and turned back to the family. "Okay, I guess that does it for now. Is it all right if I contact you at the numbers you've provided?" Mr. Calum nodded, but Jen had the presence of mind to ask, "Are charges being filed against us?" Mallory gave a tired smile. "No, ma'am. That was never our intention." Jen visibly exhaled. "Thank you." The detective nodded. "You're welcome. I look forward to getting this cleared up." Mallory and the therapist watched as the family exited the station, and then the detective spoke in a low tone. "Did he say anything that will help us?" The therapist paused for a long moment, so long that Mallory had to finally look at her. "Well, it's bad. They're going to need help." She looked at the effigy and dropped her casual act. "We need a team out in those woods immediately. What he described is straight out of a horror movie, and there is definitely an adult involved." A tone of sarcasm crept into her voice. "On the bright side, he does still hope he can save the deer from the Wendigo." Mallory leaned his head back and uttered, "Oh, shit." The therapist nodded. "Yeah, he said he wasn't trying to prank the Ganderings at all. He dragged that thing out of the woods because he wanted to bury it." Mallory stared back down at this thing as his lip curled. Too much work was put into this. Whoever made it is going to come looking for it. Sunday, 6:32 p.m. The Pritchard residence sat well away from the road. As Mallory's headlights swept across the front of the ramshackle house, he could see deer antlers nailed over the front door and darkened windows. The detective left the headlights on and the engine running as he stepped out of the vehicle, instinctively brushing his hand across his sidearm. He walked slowly to the front door to knock, but as soon as his knuckles hit the wood, the door swung open. Mallory looked down to see that the lock and handle had been busted, but it must have been some time ago, judging by the wood rot. He loudly announced himself as he shone his flashlight inside the filthy living room, where more sets of antlers hung on the walls, eerily reminding Mallory of the charnel scene from the woods he had just left. The detective pulled his sidearm and shouted forcefully this time, "Police! Ronan Pritchard! Identify yourself!" Silence. Mallory stepped inside, his heart beating. He moved to flick a light switch, but no light came on. "Ronan Pritchard, my name is Detective Seth Mallory. Identify yourself immediately." Still no answer. Mallory held his gun over the flashlight and swept the beam to the left and right, walking around a coffee table covered in takeout containers. He made it to the doorway of the kitchen, and a scene of grime and filth met his eyes. The refrigerator door was ajar, but no light peeked out, and Mallory realized that the house had no power. He stalked through the remaining rooms, dread building over what he might find, but when he was finished, he breathed a sigh of relief. There was nobody here. And mercifully, there were no signs of violence. Mallory holstered his weapon and brought out his phone, quickly rewalking the rooms and taking video of each. When he finished, he was relieved to exit the house and locked himself inside his vehicle. He chided himself for the fear he felt, but had to admit that what he had seen today was enough to shake anyone. This scene they had found in the woods was every bit the horror that the boy had described, and now the sight of the deer heads in Pritchard's house crept over Mallory's skin like spiders. He had never wanted to leave a place so badly in his life. As soon as he was on the road, he radioed the station. "Pritchard is our man. He's not home, so put on a call to pick him up on site. I'm on my way in." Sunday, 10:28 p.m. Wait, You're telling me that Gandering told the nurse he had nightmares about this thing before he saw it? The younger officer spoke in between bites of sandwich. That's what he said. When I asked him about it, he brushed me off, said he was just rambling, and went off on his tirade about arresting the boy. Mallory rubbed his eyes. Is the nurse willing to give an official statement if it comes to that? The officer nodded. Yeah, no problem. Mallory thanked him as the other man left the room. All right, good work. Now he brought his attention back to the printouts that littered his desk. To the left was a property deed bearing the name of Misty Carson, Ronan Pritchard's mother. Unlike her son, she was easy to find, working at a local establishment known as the Bear Trap. Mallory waited over 10 minutes on hold, and when she finally picked up, she was out of breath and spoke quickly. She yelled over the music that she didn't live at the house anymore, and if Ronan wasn't at home, she didn't know where he was. Mallory heard her name announced over the loudspeaker, and Misty yelled, Don't you hurt him, he's a good boy, and then she left the phone hanging. Ronan Pritchard was in his young 20s and had no priors, but he was a loner, stayed unemployed most of the time, and didn't appear to have much to do with society in general. He was also living like an animal with no electricity in a house that was only a couple of miles away from the horror scene in the forest. To the right side of Mallory's desk were artist renderings of creatures with skulls and antlers, iconography found in association with the name Wendigo. There were other names for it as well, and this image, this horrific monster, was popularized in several movies and video games, but Mallory was not searching for a fictional creature. What concerned him more was another discovery, a holiday practice in Britain known as the hooded animal tradition, where people placed animal skulls on poles and then draped sheets over the skulls to hide the person carrying it. To the left of his desk, Mallory had a stack of printouts of horse skull called the Mary Lude, and it was creepy, but still nothing compared to what Mark had found. In the center of his desk were the therapist's notes. She was leaning toward the logical scenario where Mark had met an adult and was being groomed, threatened, and brainwashed to the point that he believed what he was saying. She ran backgrounds on all the employees at his school, but there were no hits. She was still looking. Mallory tapped the keyboard and returned to the website he had found earlier. It explained the modern use of a scientific term that, like so many others, had been hijacked by pop culture to describe something different than its definition. In this case, Therian was now used to describe a person who perceives themselves to be part animal or having animal traits. Mark Callum had spent hours explaining to the therapist how he felt he was supposed to protect the deer. He had never seen deer before moving to this new house, and he loved going into the woods to find them. He would follow them around, sometimes getting quite close to them, and he described it all with a sense of happiness and belonging. But when he found the catacomb under the rock ledge, everything changed. That's when he said the Wendigo followed him home. Mark started to have nightmares, and the deer began to run away from him as soon as he was near. At that point, the boy became genuinely terrified, and he made a decision that he had to do something before this thing hurt the deer or came for him. There were lots of pieces to this puzzle. The problem was that too many of them didn't fit. Leonard Gandering told a nurse he'd dreamt about the effigy before he saw it. In Mallory's mind, that made no sense, and he discarded it. Mark Callum, upon finding the catacomb of horror, was so driven by terror, he actually removed the effigy to bury it. This made no sense either. Mallory had been to the place, and anyone that came across this scene like that, they would likely run away and never go back. And then there was Ronan Pritchard, who lived like an animal and decorated his entire house with deer heads. That did make sense, but what didn't was that nobody had seen the man for weeks. He was nowhere to be found. Mallory sighed. He had Wendigos and Therians, a macabre graveyard in the woods, and a list of people infatuated with deer. Tired and frustrated, Mallory shut down the computer. He'd sent queries to the state and the FBI with images of the effigy and left questions for the therapist. He'd done all he could for now, and he needed sleep. Monday, 4:02 a.m. Mark Callum is missing. The words jolted Mallory as he sat up in bed. Dispatch continued. Jen Callum just called it in. We already sent a car. Shit. Tell them I'm on my way. Only half awake, Mallory threw on clothes and was in the car before he knew it. He drove like a bat out of hell and pulled into the Callum's driveway behind the cruiser, still flashing its blues. He was almost to the door when the other officer stepped out with his hands out in front of him. It's okay. They found him. He's safe. Mallory's head was spinning. He's safe? The officer nodded. Yeah, he's fine. Son of a bitch. I thought we lost him. The officer grabbed Mallory's shoulder. I know. Same here. Mallory was jittery with shock and lack of sleep. What the hell happened? The kid was under his bed. When the mother went to check on him, she just thought the room was empty and she freaked. He must have been out like a light because he just woke up a few minutes ago. I was just about to call it in. Yeah, okay. I'll go inside and check on them. Monday, 8:51 a.m. Mallory rubbed his temples. He'd driven in straight from the Callums and was praying to make it through the morning without anything else crazy happening. An officer walked to his desk with a drawn face. Detective, you said that Pritchard wasn't home last night when you were there. Yes, that's right. The officer frowned. Have you watched the video you took? A sense of dread crept over Mallory. Not yet. Why? The officer slowly handed him a tablet. Mallory pressed play and watched the beam of his flashlight pan the walls of the house. It seemed creepier than he remembered, and his dread was growing as the light slowly swept across the center of the living room. Underneath the coffee table, eyeshine highlighted in the light, the dirty face of Ronan Pritchard looking straight at the camera. Mallory almost dropped the tablet. Detective, you all right? Mallory uttered a reflexive, yes, but he was far from it. His head spun, and he wasn't sure how much more he could process at the moment. The intercom buzzed. Detective Mallory? He pressed the intercom. Yes? An FBI agent is here to see you. This concludes Chapter 1 of Therian. I'm Colleen McKnight, and thank you for listening.